trying to get the girl. Yeah. And she was doing it with protection. That was just rough. If Sabrina did swing back, it would have been for school.
Yeah,
I didn't see Sabrina swing back. I saw Sabrina trying to get away. And because the girl was on her back.
Is this a soccer thing?
Yeah, we had to finish our game 8 minutes early because one of the other girls jumped on one of our girls. She like jumped. It was Amanda. She really did. It was really bad. Like,
Just so you know, I've already started recording.
Oh.
Not that it matters. I mean, I don't think it matters. You haven't said anything wrong. Chris, did that?
Well, we won. So.
Good.
Yeah, 3-0. Woo. Counts.
Really?
We're at 297.
Like literally jumped her.
Yes. Yeah.
Yikes.
It was bad. It's on film, so we're gonna. Our coach was watching it last night to see, rewatch and see what happened, because he couldn't see what happened from the side.
As he should. This is how I end up. I don't basically that's why you wear it. Oh no. All right, so this is being screencasted for people all day who are absent because that seems to be a lot with the quarantine protocols and all that. I want to try to give you these notes. I think these notes make a very simple common sense. You could probably, if I ask you questions about these, you could probably get them done anyway. This is just to be sure, and then I'm going to do some reviews with you. Those of you listening, you will not be having the reviews in front of you, but I can put some Quizlets and stuff like that on Classroom eventually. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. This is about the Industrial Revolution. At least that's what you called it when you were in world history last year. This year we're going to call it industrialization. And we've looked at that kind of already, but we looked at content statement 9, which was about the unions, right? And that's because my student teacher wanted to start there, and I was like, that's fine. So we've actually got to backtrack and go to content statement 8 now, which is more of the basics behind Industrial Revolution and then what happens. And so basically, Industrial revolution just means change, right? We've got to find out today what were some of those big, wide-scale changes that were happening in American society because of industrialization. So let's go ahead and get started. The United States was once an agrarian society. I'm using that word because it has been used on end of course exams before. Agrarian. Anybody think they know what it means? Yeah? Agricultural. Same word. It's like the same root word, right? Agri. So if that doesn't make sense, then here it is. It means that most people worked as farmers and most people lived in rural country areas. All right? Awesome. So that's what the United States was like before. Then around 1800, this started to change. I mean, after all, isn't that really what history is? Is the study of change over time? And that's what we're studying. We're studying why was it like this before, and why was it like a different way afterwards? What happened to change that? And that's what we're talking about here. America became more urban, and it became more industrial. And I think everybody here has a good idea as far as what that means, but just in case, this means that people started to live in cities more and worked in factories more. If that process started by 1800, then by 1880, it's like a magical demarcation. It's a watershed mark. It's like you can point to 1880 as a time period when there were more people working in factories than on farms. So it takes a couple of generations for us to get to that point. But by 1880 and after, the percentage of farmers goes down, and the percentage of industrial workers goes up. Just out of curiosity, do you have any idea today what percentage of our population works as farmers? Good guess, even less.
7.
Good guess, even less.
5?
Good guess, even less.
2.
2 to 3%. 2 to 3% feed the rest of us. Talk about heroes, like no joke, right? And I'm not just saying that because I came from Logan Hill. I'm not just saying that. If you look here, manufacturing centers in the country. I know that my bulb is not very bright right now. Does it look like it's dimmer to you than it has been? Yeah, I don't know if I can get that fixed. We'll see what I'll ask Mr. Garman. But the point is right here, there's a little reddish area, it's a little darker. This is where you would have found most of the manufacturing in 1820. You know, not even like 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. But by 1850, just 10 years before the Civil War, manufacturing has spread and it's gotten even more concentrated here. And gosh, even the upper part of Michigan was more industrial. Notice there's not a lot of that in the South. Just wanted you to notice that. Industrialization, then, is the process of going from manual labor to mechanized labor or machine-powered labor. What this means is that people began to have machines do the work for them instead of doing the work by hand, manually. Do you remember from last year what was the first mechanized industry? The first industry that was machine driven in the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. Textiles, thank you. Clothing, right? So beforehand, if you wanted to get clothing, you would have to take the wool and you'd have to spin it in your hands by hand into thread. And then you'd have to by hand spool it into spools, right? Because of industrial pollution, you could have machines do that spinning and that spooling. And then spinning jenny. You talked about spinning jenny last year, and the flying shuttle and all that kind of stuff, right? To help make the clothing. So it goes from hand, and see, that seems like a very simple switch, right? It doesn't seem like that's a big change, like doing this by hand versus having a machine do it, right? Like your average everyday job or life doesn't seem to change that much because you're still working with textiles, right? But if you add all of those changes up together that every single person encountered, and you add it all, you combine it all together, you get massive changes across the country. Like the social and economic and even political changes by that one simple switch from manual to machine labor was breathtaking. And this is happening in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Now, a small thing, not a big thing, but sometimes on in-course exam stuff, they don't say 1800s. They instead say the century that it is. What century are we in right now? The 21st century, right? And notice, if you want to get what hundreds that is, you just take minus 1, 21 minus 1, and you get it's the 2000s, right? So, the 1800s, therefore, was what century? Right? 18 plus 1 would be 19, right? And 20th century would be the 19th. There you go. Redeem yourself, right? Just so you know, not a big deal, but that's something that might come up. So, late 1800s, early 1900s, or late 19th century, early 20th century. Okay, so this changed the economy big time. These changes compiled up together changes the economy big time. People are starting to work in different places and buy different products than they ever had before. So, working in different places, instead of working either in a field outside or in a small shop inside of town, they're starting to work in these huge warehouse complexes that span for acres. and they're having to work with other people side by side, and they're buying different products than ever before. You see, because you used to have to, clothing was so expensive, so labor intensive before machines that you'd have to make your own because you couldn't afford to go out and buy it from somebody else. But now that everybody seems to be making them, and they're making them faster, and they're making more of them because of machines, the price goes. What happens to the price when the supply goes up? The price goes down when supply goes up, right? And so people could afford it. They're buying food inside of steel cans, which is a new invention. They're buying Coca-Cola, which is being manufactured in a factory, right? Those kind of things in the late 1800s. So businesses became larger, and as we have seen already, they start to have more power and influence. Here's a word that you probably heard before, but just so you understand, a corporation is not just a business. It's not just your mom and pop shop on the corner downtown. A corporation is usually a business that has factories and offices all across the country. And we start to get that during the industrial era, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Carnegie Steel was all across the country. Had plants all across the country. Standard Oil all across the country. Coca-Cola all across the country. Hershey all across the country. So their power and influence is rising as there are more of these places and there's more money being produced. And a lot of these corporations that are coming in this late 1800s time period is what we call heavy industry. A lot of them. When I say heavy industry, I'm not talking about textiles. Textiles don't weigh very much, and they don't take huge machines to be able to produce. But when you're talking about things like coal, that in and of itself is a heavy material. It weighs a lot, and it takes heavy machines to get it out of the ground. Iron, same thing. Very heavy machines to get that thing out of the ground, and of course it's heavy itself. Can you extract steel out of the ground? Okay, why not? What does it take to get steel then?
You have to take iron, you put it in a machine, you have to weigh it and carry it, and it comes out of steel. It's real powerful.
Yeah. Somebody third period said lava. And what I think that person meant was you take that iron and you heat it up so that it looks like lava, right? Like you said, you heat it up. And then you said aerate? Is that what you said?
You like weigh it and aerate it. Is that not you do it?
No, that's a good word. I just want to make sure I heard you right. Like, you pump hot air into it, right? And iron, even though it's strong, has a lot of impurities in it. And then once you pump that air into it and the impurities come out, you get the stronger mill steel, which helps you build railroad tracks that last longer and skyscrapers that can go higher, etc. Now, some of these corporations that had nationwide influence was Andrew Carnegie's Steel Company, which is aptly named. Anyone? Carnegie Steel, there you go. Imagine that. Then you have John D. Rockefeller's company, which was called Standard Oil because it was supposed to be the standard for kerosene in the country. Remember, at this point, it's kerosene, not gasoline. And one person we haven't talked about yet is J.P. Morgan. You relate to him? J.P. Morgan? If you were, you'd probably be rich. Because he was absolutely filthy rich. It's funny, we have a Morgan, we have a Pinkerton here. I don't think there's any big ones on the graphs. Woodrow Wilson. Yeah. We'll see if you like him. I predict that you won't like him very much. Maybe you will. We'll see. Good for you. J.P. Morgan was in everything. He bought Carnegie Steel for $500 million from Andrew Carnegie when Carnegie decided to retire in 1901. And back then, $500 million was like, it was like, if you compare it to today, it would be like I don't know if it's $1 trillion merger, but it would be way up there in the hundreds of billions of dollars. right? As far as comparing. Um, he also owned, so he turned Carnegie Steel into U.S. Steel, but he also owned General Electric, and he had Thomas Edison running that electric power company. He also owned the New York Central Railroad, which he bought from Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he was into banking as well. And so J.P. Morgan had so much, he was into so many different things that wasn't even funny. And it was really a toss-up in 1901 as to who's the most powerful person in the country was. Was it the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, or was it J.P. Morgan? And it probably depended on the day as far as, where the balance of that went to. And we're going to learn more about him hopefully tomorrow. By the way, tomorrow, planned sub day for me. This class won't have any problems, but I'm just saying it because I say it to everybody. Don't mess with my sub, or else the next day we will have a discussion that you won't like. Okay? I'm going to have him play a video. It's about J.P. Morgan. It's the Men Who Built America. Just answer the questions, do your thing. Don't mess with the sub, and then I will be happy. Thank you very much. Now, what I'm saying is that no longer is the country full of farmers as much. And we're not even talking about textiles anymore. We're talking about factories that are dangerous to work in, where you could literally die, and people did die or get maimed, like you saw in the Homestead Clinic with this heavy industry. Okay. Oh, look at me. See that? If you can't go on a roller coaster ride here, then maybe the words can't at least. Okay. So another word that's in this content statement is the word predominance. And predominance is another way of saying majority. So if I say that the country was predominantly industrial, then that means they went from mostly farmers to factory workers. That the majority of the country by 1880 and after were predominantly, mostly in the industrial sector. And if I say that the nation was predominantly urban, that means that people went from living in the countryside to living in the city. There was the majority of people living in urban areas. That's what predominance means, majority. And when they moved to the city, it seems like so many people were flocking to the city because they were trying to escape the farm life and get factory jobs that would be regular and wouldn't depend on the seasons and the weather. So many people flocked to the cities that the cities couldn't keep up. And so living in the city in the late 1800s was not always nice because people were crowded together. And the conditions were often dirty and disease spread very easily. This is called urbanization. And we still see the effects of it today because still inner cities aren't that great anymore. But we're talking about some major crowding during this time period, which we'll actually look more at in depth when we get to evolution. But for now, everybody good with that page? Anybody need me to? Okay. So just look at American cities from 1820 to 1860. In 1820, we've got a couple here. New York's the biggest, Philly, Baltimore, Boston, right? But then by 1860, we're starting to grow, and this has to do with industrialization in these places. And notice, a lot of that growth is happening in the north, not as much in the south. And this is the kind of crowding I'm talking about. These are tenement houses. These are, if you don't know what a tenement is, it's an apartment complex where they try to crowd and cram as many people as possible into as small a space as possible. I've seen some of these in New York City. Places like this, you would have 8, 9, 10 people living in a 3-room apartment. And there was one bathtub, no toilet, a kitchen, and a bedroom. That was it. If you were lucky, you had an apartment with a toilet. Most tenements early on, especially in the 1870s, there was one toilet restroom per floor and maybe one water spigot per floor. And you had to share all that. And look at how dirty and cramped it got because of that. And then disease spread like wildfire too. Something called the white plague or tuberculosis, right? If you got that in your lungs, it spread really quickly, like faster than COVID, which spreads faster than the flu, right? And then, half your floor is either sick or dying the next day. And maybe we shouldn't talk about cholera. Because you know what cholera is? Cholera is basically death by diarrhea. Where does this come from? Okay, so today our main transportation method are cars, and cars have waste, right? What's the waste out of cars? Yeah, the carbon monoxide or dioxide that's coming out of the tailpipe, right? The exhaust. And we think that hurts us because of climate change and so on and so forth, but we don't really feel it immediately unless you're right behind the tailpipe and you're sucking into, right? Which is kind of weird thing to do, right? But back then, what was the main method of transportation?
Lawn.
Or horses. Train will come eventually. Horses also have waste.
Dookie.
Urine and feces, right? Poop and pee. And there's really nowhere for that to go except in the street, right? And so just imagine how dirty and filthy it was when there are hundreds of thousands of people crammed into New York City or Philadelphia. And what are you going to do about it? And nobody did that stuff, at least at first, right? And then it seeps down into the water system. And then when you're drinking water that is contaminated, and you might get cholera, and when you get that bacteria, the cholera bacteria or virus, whatever it is inside of you, your body wants to get rid of it so bad that it makes you have diarrhea to flush it out. And you basically, because it's so violent, you die of dehydration pretty quick. And this is something that was very common because there wasn't water filtration systems back then. There wasn't as much sewage systems back then, right? Dysentery is another, yeah, right? I don't think that cholera and dysentery are exactly the same, but they have the same result, pretty much. The farmers also got into this whole thing. Farmers became industrialized. You look at some farm equipment today, we're talking like $500,000 for some of these machines, maybe even more, right? And they are awesome. And some of them are GPS self-guided. Like you just sit there and you just plug in the coordinates and it just goes, right? And it's just amazing, right? Farming got into this. The innovations of the time period, or inventions of the time period, helped provide machine labor for farms that helped plant and harvest easier and faster. Some examples of these innovations, these inventions, were John Deere's steel plow. Out west in Nebraska and Kansas, the soil is pretty much clay. It's hard to get into. Iron plows can kind of dig into it, but the steel helped these farmers turn Kansas and Nebraska into a breadbasket because they were able to dig into, the steel was stronger. And then, of course, later on in around the 1900s, when tractors started to come out, that helped you pull your machines, pull your plow instead of by horse. I'm not really sure because we live in Circleville. How many of you have experience on the farm? Do you work on your grandparents' farm ever, or your uncles and aunts? Okay. No, not much. Yeah. What have you? What kind of farm labor have you done, Sylvia? Hay bale. Is Slater and I the only ones who's ever baled hay before straw? A couple of you have. Okay, that's hard work, right? That'll put hair on your chest, right? And maybe I don't know, maybe we should just do that as a part of a field trip someday. Just go out this fall and bale straw. So straw's weighs less than hay, right? Maybe we should we do that? Just try to see what. Because, we live in Circleville. Not everybody's experienced that, right? Maybe you've heard of this, then, if you know farm labor. Maybe you haven't. The mechanical reaper. The reaper takes the plants and kind of cuts them off at the bottom of the stalk, and then you can gather it up. That's a lot better than taking that sickle, that scythe, and going like, the Grim Reaper. It just takes a long time. And the thresher, Jerome Case's thresher, takes the grain and separates it from the stalk and the chaff so that you can have the food part over here and the waste part over here. And because of these, farmers can produce a lot more than ever before. Play ball. Did you like that said? All right, let's see. City Slickers. Do you know what this is? Of those three, yeah?
I don't know what it is, you go back, start.
Oh, okay. That was the plow, thank you, because second period said it was something different, and third period almost said it was the reaper. It's not the reaper. Those were the times. Like, which one are you looking at?
The one right after blood. At the bottom.
Grain?
No,
Thresher? This is the plow. It digs into the dirt. Okay, what's this one? It could be a death machine. That's the reaper, right? These wings right here, cut the come together and cut the thing. Oh, so that means this is
That's the thresher.
that's the thresher. Put the whole stalk and grain up here like wheat. Out it sips it, and out comes the chaff over here, and the stuff you can use for food, the grain over here. Factories became larger during this time period. What I mean by that is not just there were more factories, but there were actually the factories themselves became much bigger. When we get to Henry Ford's factory, not only is it acres, but actually you start measuring his factory in square miles, right? And it's so big. As opposed to early on in industrialization, all production actually is from start to finish done inside the factory. What helps make a factory work more efficient was the mechanized or the machine-powered assembly line, which I'm sure you all know what that means, right? I stand here, a part comes down to me on a conveyor belt, and I tighten the bolt, and then it goes on, and the next guy tightens another bolt, and I stand here the entire time doing this one job all day, and I do it really good. And how much fun do you think that is? I mean, that's even more boring than taking Mr. Beaver's lecture notes, if you can believe that, right? I mean, holy cow. Maybe that should be our field trip instead. We should go to the toilet paper plant, and you can sit here all day doing this instead of like bleach and stuff. I actually did work in a factory, but I got to drive a forklift. One of those, not the ones you sit down on that has a front end loader, but like I stood up and I had to do all these kind of weird things, and like it raised it and you can extend it out and come back and that was good stuff. Finally, last but not least, the innovations of the era. You know what goes in this blank? Telephone. Invented by Alexander Graham Bell. The very first message that goes across a telephone wire is Bell, actually, I think, yelling, thinking that the telephone hadn't worked yet, yelling, down the hallway to his assistant, Watson. But Watson heard it over the telephone receiver, and he said, "Watson, come here, I need you." That was the first thing to ever go across a telephone wire. Much different than the telegraph, the telegraph, the dash, dash, dot, dot, Morse code kind of thing. The very first message sent across that was, "What hath God wrought?" Because they understood this thing is so new and crazy that you can communicate between New York and Philadelphia just like that, instead of carrying letters. Okay, anyway, how about this one? The early sound recording device. That's a sound picking up device. The sound receiving device. But what was the sound recording device? No and no, but you're not far off. It's Thomas Edison, and it's the phonograph. Phonograph by Thomas Edison. Phone, sound, the root word in Greek is sound. Now, this word right here is a description of the type of light bulb that was invented during this time period. Today, our light bulbs they don't light up because they're heated. But these early type of light bulbs did, yeah? Good. Incandescent light bulb. Very good. It glows, it gives off light because it's heated. And who invented this? Edison. It's said that he like tried and failed with 5,000 different things or something like that before he found the right filament that would flow. And he didn't say I failed 5,000 times. He said I figured out 5,000 ways not to do a light bulb. Yeah.
And for me, change it again. It was first used bamboo, and it worked forever, and then he wasn't going to sell them.
I think he used a carbon filament in its place later, something like that. Right? Yeah, that's good. The washing machine becomes more popular in the later part of this industrial era, the 1920s. The skyscraper, which was made taller by steel, comes about in the late 1800s. Does anybody know what the process is called that turns iron into steel? Good guess. It was named after Henry Bessemer. He was an English inventor.
Mesmerization.
Sure. The Bessemer process, which remember, iron into steel by forcing hot air through, or air through the hot molten iron, which purifies it. And then Carnegie perfects the Bessemer process and starts making more steel than the entire country that invented the Bessemer process. Then, of course, we get the automobile by Henry Ford. He made the car Fordable. That joke. And, of course, Orville and Wilbur Wright invented the airplane, guys from the Dayton area. And they're awesome. Let's try to review this. If you're listening, I'm going to turn it off in just a second. Nope, that's the same thing I just gave you, so take that back. Let's try to see if the vocab is making sense to you. Here is a fill in the blank. On the back is a word bank. I'll give you a hint. The very first one starts with the letter C. And let's see in 5 minutes if you all can if you have a good grasp on these vocab terms.